Decoding 360 degrees. Today's analysis looks at this through the lens of sense-making. The Great Frost began just after Christmas, in the winter of 1813. It was not only the cold that marked those days, but a dense, persistent fog. The fog reached London on the evening of December 27th, and did not lift until January 3rd. Visibility was so poor that travelling became dangerous, and even the mail struggled to move through the city. Contemporary accounts described it as a darkness that could almost be felt. What is striking is not just the freezing temperatures. It is this moment of disorientation, a city unable to see clearly, unsure of what it was entering. Before the river froze into something solid, before it became usable, there was first this pause. When the environment stops behaving as expected, the first response isn't action, it's sense-making. Walking through the city became difficult. People carried lanterns just to see where they were going, and even then, many lost their way in streets they knew perfectly well. Familiar routes suddenly felt unfamiliar. Coaches moved slowly and awkwardly. Drivers confused pavements with roads, and roads with pavements, as if the city's basic layout had blurred. What stands out here is not chaos, but disorientation. Nothing had physically changed. The streets were the same, the buildings were the same, and yet, the city no longer made sense in the way people expected. When everyday surroundings stop being readable, ordinary knowledge stops being enough. By the end of December, the fog had grown thicker, especially at night. Moving through the city now required real effort and attention, even for people who knew the streets well. If you had something important to do, you could not rely on memory alone. Many people carried torches, not out of habit, but out of necessity. Light became a tool for getting through the city, not just for seeing, but for staying oriented. What is starting to shift here is subtle. People are no longer just disoriented, they are adjusting how they move. When familiar knowledge stops being reliable, behavior begins to change. The street lamps were still there, but through the fog they looked no brighter than small candles. Light no longer reached far enough to be useful. The city had not gone dark, but it had lost depth. You could see what was close, but not what lay ahead. At this point, moving through London meant constantly adjusting, walking slower, paying closer attention, relying on whatever light you could find. When visibility shrinks, the world becomes smaller, and people adapt to that scale. Some coachmen stopped driving from the seat altogether, and got down to lead their horses on foot. Others kept moving, but only at a slow walking pace. The usual rules of the road no longer worked. Carriages met where they were not meant to, paths crossed awkwardly, and small mistakes quickly turned into problems. What matters here is not the disruption itself, but the response. People adjusted their behavior in real time, lowering speed, changing roles, doing whatever was needed to keep moving. When conditions shift and control becomes uncertain, progress depends less on efficiency and more on caution. People became more cautious, and you can almost feel the tension in how they moved. Passengers were alert all the time, watching the street, listening closely, ready to react. You hear short warnings, shouted on impulse. Someone's coming. Careful, watch out. Not panic, but constant awareness. What's happening here is small, but important. When the environment becomes unpredictable, coordination shifts from rules to voices. People rely less on systems and more on each other, using quick signals to avoid mistakes as they go. Some women had already gone out before the fog settled in. Once visibility dropped, finding their way back became difficult, and in some cases, impossible. This wasn't about recklessness, it was about timing and circumstance. The city had become hard to read for everyone, but not everyone experienced that risk in the same way. Being outside, alone and disoriented, carried different consequences. When conditions change suddenly, uncertainty does not fall evenly. It exposes who is more vulnerable to getting lost. As the fog finally cleared, it didn't bring relief. Almost immediately, heavy snow began to fall. It wasn't just another snowfall. People described it as unlike anything they could remember. Deeper, heavier, harder to move through. Just when the city started to regain visibility, the ground itself became difficult to navigate. What had been a problem of seeing turned into a problem of moving. One form of uncertainty gave way to another. The conditions kept changing, and with them, the rules for getting through the city. After a few brief pauses, the snow returned and didn't really stop for 2 full days. It kept falling over ground that was already frozen solid, layered with weeks of cold underneath. At this point, it wasn't just bad weather anymore. Everything was piling up. Cold on top of cold, snow on top of ice. Moving through the city became heavier, slower, more demanding. Not because of one single condition, but because nothing had time to reset. When change comes in waves without a break in between, adaptation becomes cumulative. Each adjustment has to sit on top of the previous one. For most of this period, the wind came steadily from the north and northeast, and it was bitterly cold. Not the kind of cold that passes, but the kind that settles in and stays. The air itself worked against people. Every step, every movement, felt heavier, sharper, more exposed. By now, the city wasn't just dealing with separate conditions: fog, snow, ice, wind. They were stacking up, reinforcing each other. When pressure becomes constant, endurance turns into a daily task, not an exception. By now, daily systems were starting to fail. Travel was disrupted, water pipes froze, and ice built up everywhere. And then the river stopped behaving like a river. For nearly 2 weeks, the Thames was blocked at low tide between London Bridge and Blackfriars. Boats couldn't move. The usual flow of the city slowed, then stalled. What matters here is not just the cold, but the shift it forced. When infrastructure breaks down, the city has to start looking for stability somewhere else. By this point, it wasn't just the Thames. Ponds and smaller rivers across London were frozen solid. People didn't just look at the ice, they stepped onto it. Skating quickly became popular, especially in places like the canal at St James's Park and the Serpentine in Hyde Park. What's striking is how fast this shift happens. Spaces that were never meant to be walked on suddenly became places to gather, move and play. When a system holds long enough, people stop treating it as an exception and start treating it as usable. At this point, communication itself started to break down. Mail services were disrupted in a way people hadn't experienced before. Roads disappeared under the snow, not blocked, erased. With no visible paths left, travel slowed to a crawl or stopped entirely. Anyone who had to move through the countryside was essentially making their own route, step by step, without knowing what lay ahead. When the landscape loses its markers, movement becomes a matter of judgment and risk, not routine. Connection depends no longer on systems, but on individual decisions made in uncertainty. At some point, movement simply stopped. Wagons, carts, coaches, everything was left where it stood. Right in the middle of the storm, drivers realized they couldn't go any further. So they unharnessed the horses, led them to the nearest shelter they could find. There was no shortcut here, no clever adjustment. Progress depended on something very basic: clearing a path before it was safe to move again. This is what a hard limit looks like. When conditions overwhelm improvisation, the only option left is to pause and wait for the system to be made passable again. On Wednesday the 26th, the wind shifted to the southwest, and the change was noticeable almost immediately. The thaw began to set in. Ice softened, snow turned heavy, and the ground started to give way underfoot. Movement returned, but not smoothly. This wasn't a clean return to normal. It was a messy in-between phase, where frozen systems loosened before they fully recovered. When conditions start to reverse, stability doesn't come back all at once. It arrives unevenly, creating a different kind of uncertainty. Over the next few days, as the thaw continued, things didn't really improve. They got harder in a different way. Snow began to melt, water pooled everywhere, and streets turned into a mix of slush and flooding. Moving through the city became slow, awkward and exhausting. What had been frozen solid was now unstable. The ground no longer held, but it didn't clear either. This is the phase people often forget. When a system starts to recover, it can become less usable before it becomes functional again. Just as the thaw had begun to loosen things, the cold returned. On Sunday the 30th, a sharp frost set in again, and held on for nearly another week. Surfaces that had softened refroze. Water turned back into ice. The city was pushed once more into adjustment mode, but now with layers of experience already built in. Change didn't move in a straight line. It oscillated. And with each swing, people had to recalibrate how they moved, where they stood, and what they could rely on. By this point, a few people began to step onto the ice, carefully, cautiously, testing different sections rather than trusting the whole surface. This wasn't confidence, it was curiosity mixed with necessity. Each step was a small experiment, checking whether the ice could hold, whether this new surface could be used. What matters here is not how many people went out, but that someone did. That moment when a boundary is no longer treated as fixed, but as something negotiable. By Monday afternoon, this was no longer a private experiment. Hundreds of people gathered on Blackfriars and London bridges just to watch. They stood there for hours, following a small group of men as they crossed the Thames, and then crossed it again, back and forth. At one point, dozens of people were on the ice at the same time, moving between the two banks as if the river had briefly forgotten what it was supposed to be. What's happening here is subtle but important. The moment the action draws a crowd, the risk starts to feel shared. And once something is seen often enough, it begins to feel less exceptional. By Tuesday, February 1st, something decisive had happened. The moving sheets of ice had piled up against London Bridge and stopped drifting. Once they settled, the river between Blackfriars and further down toward Queenhithe began to feel solid. Not in pieces, not in patches, but as one continuous surface. This wasn't a sudden freeze. It was accumulation, pressure, and time doing their work. The Thames didn't just look frozen anymore. It behaved like ground. And once a space behaves differently, people start treating it differently. Once it was clear the ice would hold, the watermen moved fast. They put up notices at the end of every street leading down to the river, basically saying, "There's a safe way to walk across now." And of course, that changed everything. People didn't just come to look anymore. They came to try it. A few stepped out first, cautiously. Others watched, then followed. And once enough people were on the ice, hesitation disappeared. What had been a river turned into a shared space. Crowds poured in, paths formed, stalls went up, distractions appeared. This wasn't bravery anymore, it was momentum. The ice didn't just support bodies, it supported behavior. Up to this point, it's easy to think this is just a weather story. Ice, cold, disruption. But something else has happened. Nature stopped being background and turned into infrastructure. Risk stopped being personal and became socially permitted. People stopped watching and started participating. From here on, this isn't about a frozen river anymore. It's about how a city reorganizes itself when the ground literally moves. And then there's this scene, which almost feels unreal. Someone decides to roast a small sheep right there on the ice, tied up and held over a coal fire set inside a big iron pan. People stop, gather around, and suddenly it's a spectacle. You pay sixpence just to watch it happen, and people do, happily. Once it's cooked, the meat gets sliced and sold for £1 apiece, dressed up with a new name, Lapland mutton, as if that somehow makes sense of what you're seeing. And by this point it's obvious this isn't just people wandering onto the ice anymore. There are rows of makeshift booths everywhere, dressed up with flags and bits of bunting, like someone decided this was a fairground. Inside, it's the predictable stuff. Gin, beer, gingerbread, stacked and ready to sell. Not improvised, not accidental. This is organized, stocked, and open for business. By now this has fully tipped into something else. What started as people testing the ice has turned into a full-blown frost fair, and you can feel how settled it all is. The same games keep happening, the same routines repeat, and the river reads less like a river and more like a street. There's a clear main walk running straight between Blackfriars Bridge and London Bridge, almost like a high street, even given a name, the City Road, with traders lined up on both sides selling whatever they can. Everything is concentrated right here, in the middle of the city, where movement, trade, and attention usually live. At this point, the Thames isn't the backdrop anymore. It's the venue, organized, named, and used as if it was solid ground. And then it goes one step further. You're not just buying drinks or wandering around anymore. They've actually hauled printing presses out onto the ice. Not one, but several of them, set up properly, inked, working. People standing around, watching sheets being printed right there on the frozen river, commemorating the frost as it's still happening. That's the moment it really clicks. This isn't temporary curiosity. They're recording it, monetizing it, turning the event into something official, while standing on what should be water. The ice isn't just holding people up, it's supporting memory, commerce, and proof that this all really happened. By this point it's gone completely over the edge. There are even more people than before, and now the ice is basically doing a full costume change into a proper fairground. You've got swings set up, stalls selling books, people dancing inside a barge, drinking booths, skittles laid out on planks. Honestly, almost everything you'd expect to see at a fair on land has just been picked up and dropped onto the river. And people keep coming, thousands of them, just to see it, to join in, to say they were there. The ice feels solid now, like it's not even pretending to be fragile anymore. More like rock than water. And standing back, looking at it all, you can tell why people thought it was extraordinary. This isn't survival or curiosity anymore. It's a city deciding collectively that this frozen river is now a place to live, play, trade, and gather, at least for as long as it holds. By now it's basically snowballing on its own. Every day more sellers turn up, dragging in whatever they can get their hands on and putting it out for sale, often at ridiculous markups just because they can. A lot of it is pure junk, honestly, but that doesn't seem to matter. People are buying it anyway. You see books and toys everywhere with little labels saying, "Bought on the Thames," like the place itself has become the selling point. It's not about quality anymore, it's about the story. Owning something from the ice, proof that you were here, that you walked on the river when it stopped being a river and turned into a market. Once you look a bit closer, you realize this isn't just chaos or people taking advantage for fun. The watermen are making serious money here. Everyone who wants to step onto the ice pays a small toll first, a couple of pence to get in, and then another tip is quietly expected when you leave. Add it all up and some of them are said to be clearing a small fortune in a single day. And when you think about it, that makes sense. London lives off the river. It's the busiest port in the world, and when the Thames freezes, everything stops. The watermen can't carry passengers, the lightermen can't move goods, and overnight their income disappears. So this fair isn't really a novelty at first, it's a workaround. Faced with a frozen river, they fall back on what they know. Turn the ice into a controlled space, charge for access, and rebuild an economy on top of it. What looks like entertainment is actually survival, organized, priced, and enforced. Even late into the night, people are still out there on the ice, refusing to go home, as if the river has turned into a place that doesn't quite obey normal hours anymore. Under the moonlight, everything looks unreal, quieter, almost suspended, with figures moving slowly across the frozen surface, and long shadows stretching out beneath them. You can imagine how strange it must have felt, familiar landmarks still there, but the ground beneath your feet, completely transformed, the city carrying on after dark, on top of something that was never meant to hold it. By February 5th, this morning, you can already tell the fair probably won't last much longer. The wind has shifted south, and there's a light dusting of snow that feels more like a warning than decoration, but no one seems ready to let it go. People keep coming back anyway, in their thousands, brushing off the signs that things are changing, and the ice is still busy, noisy, full of movement. It's as if once the city learned how to live on the river, it didn't want to stop, even when the conditions were quietly telling everyone that this borrowed ground was about to give way again. By the evening, the crowd starts to thin out, not because anyone announced the end, but because the rain finally sets in, and the ice begins to sound different. You can almost hear it complaining, loud cracks running through it, and then you notice whole sections starting to shift, carrying printing presses, booths, bits of the fair with them, drifting off in a way that's suddenly not entertaining at all. What felt solid a few hours earlier now looks temporary, unstable, and the people who are making money here, the publicans, the printers, the stallholders, realize at the same time that this thing they built is already breaking apart. The fair doesn't end with a clear moment, it just starts dissolving, quietly but unmistakably, leaving a few stranded objects behind as proof that, for a short while, a whole city had convinced itself the river was firm ground. On Sunday, February 6th, around 2 in the morning, things suddenly shift. You can picture it clearly. The tide starts moving fast under London Bridge, faster than anyone expected, and the thaw just adds fuel to it. The ice that had felt solid for days doesn't resist anymore. One of the booths, the same kind people were walking past and buying from hours earlier, gets picked up and carried off, almost instantly, sliding toward Blackfriars Bridge, like it weighs nothing. And that's the moment it really clicks that this wasn't a fair built on land at all. It was always balanced on timing, temperature and luck, and once those flipped, the whole thing was gone in minutes. By mid-afternoon, around 3, the river looks nothing like a fairground anymore. Standing here and watching it, it honestly feels closer to an ice-choked sea than a river. Huge slabs of ice rolling past, the water sitting unnaturally high, everything moving at once. It's the kind of scene you stop talking for, because there's too much going on. The banks are packed with people who clearly came expecting stalls and games, and instead got this. You can almost feel the letdown in the crowd, everyone who thought they'd get one more day out of it. All staring at the river, realizing the fair didn't slowly wind down, it just collapsed. One moment it existed, the next it didn't, and what's left is this rough, noisy, unstoppable river, carrying the evidence away. On Monday, February 7th, looking out over the river now, it's clear the story isn't over, just because the fair is gone. There's still ice everywhere, big chunks drifting past, and all over the Thames you can see barges that have snapped loose from where they were tied up. Some are just battered, Others are completely wrecked, tilted, smashed, half sunk. You don't need a ledger to see the damage is serious. Between London Bridge and Westminster alone, people at the time were already saying the losses would run into tens of thousands of pounds, which in plain terms means this wasn't just a strange winter episode anymore. It turned into a full-blown economic hit, written directly onto the river. Looking back at what this moment really was, I'm looking at this scene knowing the story has already ended, and it feels less like an event, and more like a snapshot of a city mid-adjustment. Fires on the ice, oxen roasting, people drinking and dancing as if the ground under their feet wasn't a frozen river. Someone even marched an elephant across near Blackfriars Bridge, almost as if to prove a point. What stands out isn't the spectacle. It's how quickly the city rewired itself. The river stopped being a boundary and quietly turned into a square. The ice stopped being a hazard and became infrastructure. Without plans or permits or blueprints, everyday urban functions just slid into a new surface. Trade, leisure, movement, all migrated. When the environment changed, the city didn't pause, it reshuffled. And then there's the other layer that's harder to see. Nobody knew how long the ice would last. Nobody knew if it would hold tomorrow, or even that evening. Still, people acted as if it was stable enough. Not because they were reckless, but because life doesn't wait for certainty. Faced with something volatile and ambiguous, they adjusted expectations instead of demanding guarantees. So this image isn't really about celebration or excess. It's about how cities live inside uncertainty. When the familiar rules stop applying, people don't freeze. They normalize the unexpected just enough to keep going. They accept a bit of risk, improvise new norms, and carry on, right up to the moment the ground gives way again. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more content.